October 1907. The United States teetered on the edge of financial collapse. Banks were failing, markets were in free fall, and panic spread through Wall Street like wildfire. While the government faltered, one man seized control. Inside his private library, J.P. Morgan gathered the nation's most powerful bankers, locked the doors, and refused to let them leave until they agreed to his terms. By dawn, the crisis had eased. The country was saved by a single individual, but salvation came with a price. How had one man gained the power to dictate the fate of an entire nation? To answer that, we must return to the beginning, to a frail boy plagued by illness, who would become the ruthless consolidator of industries, the titan of steel, and the feared rival of a president. This is the story of J.P. Morgan. In the spring of 1837, in Hartford, Connecticut, a child was born into a world already shaped by privilege. His name was John Pierpont Morgan, though history would later shorten it to J.P. Morgan. The year itself was marked by a severe financial panic in the United States, and yet his family's wealth insulated them from the chaos. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was already moving in powerful circles of New England banking. From the start, the boy's path seemed destined to intersect with money, influence, and ambition. The Morgan family traced its roots to New England Puritans, people of discipline, order, and an unwavering sense of destiny. This cultural backdrop would seep into young John's life, shaping not only his worldview, but also the standards by which he measured success. Junius Morgan wasn't merely a financier. He was a man who believed discipline was the foundation of greatness. His son, born into wealth, was not allowed to drift into comfort. Instead, expectations were carved into the child's upbringing like commandments. Hartford in the mid-19th century was a town of merchants, ministers, and rising industrialists. The Morgans lived among Connecticut's elites, where status was measured not only by wealth, but by moral standing. Junius made sure his son understood that privilege carried weight, reputation, integrity, and command. These lessons weren't optional. They were the family code. Even before John could walk, he was already viewed as the heir to a serious legacy. It wasn't only his father's shadow looming large. The Morgan name carried recognition in banking circles stretching from Boston to London. Junius Morgan had cultivated connections with firms that would one day open doors for his son across the Atlantic. From the dinner table to Sunday sermons, John absorbed a constant message. His life was not his own. He belonged to something greater, a lineage, a business, and soon a nation's economy. But privilege, as history often reminds us, doesn't guarantee ease. Behind the stately home and polished upbringing, the boy's body carried weaknesses that threatened to derail the destiny his father envisioned. From a very young age, John's health proved to be a relentless adversary. He suffered from severe migraines, bouts of seizures, and recurring fevers that left him bedridden for weeks. At a time when childhood illnesses often carried fatal outcomes, each episode brought anxiety to his family. He was fragile, vulnerable, and often unable to join the other boys in games or schooling. To outsiders, the heir to the Morgan name looked like a child destined for frailty, not financial dominance. The family spared no effort in caring for him. Doctors were summoned, remedies prescribed, and trips to milder climates arranged. He spent long stretches away from Hartford, sent to recover in places believed to have curative air. These absences removed him from the routines of normal childhood, isolating him in ways that sharpened his discipline. He grew accustomed to silence, books, and long hours of solitary reflection. The illnesses hardened his willpower, even as they weakened his body. During one particularly extended illness, John's mother sat beside him and read from the Bible and classic texts. Those words of endurance, patience, and divine order imprinted on him. Though physically weak, His mind was fed with ideas of resilience and structure, and he learned to accept suffering not as defeat, but as a test. This early philosophy would follow him throughout his life, where setbacks were never final, only opportunities to assert control. By his teenage years, John had developed a reputation within the family as both delicate and determined. He lacked the energy for sports or farm labor, but he excelled in memorization, arithmetic, and structured tasks. Junius began to see that his son's fragility was paired with something far more important: focus. What John lacked in physical stamina, he made up for in mental endurance. These struggles, though painful, forged a kind of steel within him. Each fever survived, each seizure endured, deepened his capacity for discipline. The frail boy might never have been expected to dominate the world of finance, but illness gave him the patience and resolve to do exactly that. In his late teens, Junius decided his son's path could not be confined to Hartford or even the United States. He arranged for John to study in Europe, where the finest schools could offer both education and cultural polish. Switzerland first, then Germany. In the classrooms of Göttingen University, John found himself among scholars who spoke multiple languages and dissected global affairs as naturally as arithmetic. For a young American, it was like stepping into the engine room of civilization. The choice of Göttingen was deliberate. Junius wanted his son exposed to rigorous German discipline and the intellectual traditions of Europe. There, John absorbed mathematics, history, and languages. But most importantly, he was introduced to the emerging currents of international trade and banking. Professors and fellow students came from across Europe, many with family ties to business and government. John was no longer simply a Connecticut boy. He was being groomed as a man of the world. His time in Europe also refined his taste and broadened his worldview. He developed a lifelong appreciation for art, architecture, and literature, pursuits that later defined him as a collector. But beneath the culture lay something more practical. He watched how European banks operated with connections stretching across continents. He saw how family dynasties, like the Rothschilds, controlled empires that dwarfed American firms. These observations planted a seed. America too could be consolidated under one man's vision. John's letters home revealed a seriousness unusual for his age. He wrote not of youthful diversions, but of lectures attended, markets studied, and impressions of European financial systems. He compared the stability of London's banking with the volatility of Wall Street, noting America's immaturity in the global financial order. Even then, he viewed his homeland not as a fixed reality, but as a nation still waiting for discipline and control. By the time he returned to the United States, John was no longer just Junius Morgan's son. He was a young man armed with international perspective, fluent in multiple languages, and determined to bring European order to America's chaotic markets. Back in New York, John secured an apprenticeship with Duncan, Sherman and Company, a firm with ties to his father's London connections. From the very beginning, his colleagues noticed his intensity. He arrived early, stayed late, and never wasted words. While others were content with routine tasks, John approached even minor accounting work with precision. He wanted not only to perform, but to master. The banking world in the 1850s was raw and volatile. Speculation ran wild, companies rose and collapsed with frightening speed, and fortunes were made and lost in a day. John observed this with sharp eyes. He kept notebooks filled with figures, documenting the mistakes of reckless financiers. Where others saw gambling, he saw lessons in discipline. His colleagues began to whisper that this young Morgan had the makings of something rare, a man who craved control above all else. His father's reputation opened doors, but it was John's relentless work ethic that earned him respect. At Duncan, Sherman and Company, he handled foreign exchange and learned the complexities of international credit. He absorbed the mechanics of trade between America and Europe, mastering both the details of contracts and the psychology of negotiation. Every mistake, every success, was filed into his growing arsenal of knowledge. What set him apart wasn't just technical skill. It was his presence. Even as a young apprentice, he carried himself with a gravity that unsettled his peers. His stare, his silence, his refusal to indulge in frivolous chatter, all of it projected authority. Colleagues twice his age found themselves yielding to his opinions. John was becoming more than a banker, he was becoming a force. By the time he finished his apprenticeship, John had established a reputation for discipline and authority. He had proven that he was not just Junius Morgan's privileged son. He was a rising figure in his own right, one who would not be content with small victories. In 1861, as the American Civil War loomed, John married Amelia Sturgis, the daughter of a wealthy New York merchant family. It was a union of social equals, a marriage that promised happiness and stability. But within months, tragedy struck. Amelia fell ill with tuberculosis, a disease that offered little hope in that era. Their time together was brief, marked by illness, sorrow, and the cruel reminder that wealth could not shield one from fate. John's grief was profound. Friends recalled how his usual stoic exterior faltered during Amelia's decline. He left no diaries describing his pain, but those who knew him noted a shift. The young man who once displayed traces of gentleness now closed himself off. Amelia's death hardened him, creating a wall between his private emotions and the world. He would remarry years later, but something within him had already changed. Her passing reinforced lessons he had already learned in childhood, that suffering was inevitable, and control was the only true defense. He poured himself back into work, shutting the door on sentiment. The memory of Amelia lingered, but it was buried beneath ledgers, contracts, and negotiations. His emotions, once tender, became tools for discipline. To mourn was human, but to control grief was power. Observers noted that after Amelia's death, John carried himself with even greater intensity. His stare grew colder, his decisions sharper, his tolerance for weakness almost non-existent. Loss had stripped him of illusions. He no longer sought comfort in companionship, but in mastery. For Morgan, the personal and professional now fused into a single mission: to bend the world into order. Grief had turned into steel. The fragile boy was gone. In his place stood a man ready to shape industries in his image. After the Civil War ended in 1865, America's railroad industry exploded in size. Railroads were seen as the future, connecting east to west and promising growth. But too many companies were being built with no plan and too much risk. Dozens of railroad lines overlapped, competed, and failed to make profit. Investors lost money fast, and the entire industry became unstable. What was supposed to unite the country was quickly falling apart. Some railroad companies ran the same routes and undercut each other. Others borrowed too much and couldn't pay it back. With no national rules in place, the whole system became chaotic. Prices were unfair, service was unreliable, and companies collapsed without warning. People who depended on trains, farmers, workers, merchants, started to feel the pressure. What looked like progress soon became a disaster in motion. The financial markets also began to shake as railroads crumbled. Wall Street lost faith, and bank loans dried up. Each railroad failure affected banks, industries, and even local governments. There was no central figure to step in and stop the damage. The entire country's economy was riding on a broken machine, and no one seemed to know how to fix it. The government tried to help, but moved too slowly. Corruption was high, and railroad tycoons paid off politicians. With no one to enforce order, greed ruled the tracks. The result was a messy and dangerous financial web that reached across states. Business leaders were worried, but none could agree on how to bring change. It would take someone with power and discipline. That someone was J.P. Morgan. He didn't just see railroads as investments. He saw them as the spine of America's future, and where others saw confusion, Morgan saw a system waiting to be tamed. Morgan believed that strong systems beat reckless growth. He began reorganizing railroads that were falling apart in the 1870s. He forced companies to stop competing and start cooperating. This new approach had a name: Morganization. It meant discipline, structure, and total financial control. Morgan would not just fund companies, he would run them like a general. He didn't believe in wild competition or risky leadership. Under Morganization, Morgan fired weak managers and replaced them with experts. He cut costs, merged rail lines, and made sure the books were clean. Companies followed strict financial rules and stopped making sudden moves. The result was predictable profits and investor confidence. His system started to work. Business leaders began to notice that Morgan didn't fail. His reorganized railroads stopped losing money and started running on schedule. Investors lined up to follow his lead. Even people who didn't like Morgan admitted that he brought peace to a violent market. His rules weren't just saving companies, they were calming the nation's economy. That's how power started to shift toward him. But not everyone loved Morganization. Small towns complained that it gave Morgan too much say. Farmers said freight prices were being set too far away. Morgan didn't care. His focus was on big industry, not local complaints. He believed that sacrifice was needed for stability. To him, the bigger picture always mattered more. Morganization wasn't just a business strategy, it was a personal mission. Morgan believed in order, discipline, and control. What he had learned from his own pain and illness, he now applied to America's railroads. And step by step, he brought the chaos under his command. As Morgan gained power, other financiers tried to challenge him. The most aggressive was Jay Gould, a man who thrived on risk and manipulation. Gould bought and sold railroads to drive up stock prices. He didn't care about long-term success. He cared about short-term wins. Morgan saw him as reckless, and their styles clashed hard. It was only a matter of time before they collided. One major battle was over the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad. Gould sent armed men to try and take control by force. Morgan used courts, lawyers, and strategy instead of violence. In the end, Morgan won the fight and saved the company. It was a turning point in his public image. He was no longer just a banker, he was a defender of order. Other boardroom battles followed, and Morgan kept winning. He was smart, silent, and strategic, never flashy, always serious. Rivals tried to outplay him, but often failed. His calm style scared people more than shouting ever could. He built alliances, not chaos. And soon, people realized that resisting Morgan came with a cost. Newspapers loved these Wall Street showdowns. They made headlines out of Morgan versus Gould, like it was a boxing match. But the truth was deeper. These fights were shaping the rules of capitalism. Morgan wanted to prove that discipline worked better than gambling, and each time he won, that message got louder. In the end, Morgan didn't just defeat rivals, he outlived them. He created a new way of doing business, one where finance was based on control, not luck. And Wall Street would never be the same again. Controlling railroads gave Morgan more than just money, it gave him leverage. Every industry depended on trains to move goods and people. Steel, coal, oil, farming, everything needed rail. If Morgan controlled the railroads, he could influence entire sectors. That's exactly what he did. With each merger, his power spread farther. He didn't just buy more companies, he forced them to work together. He made competing lines share schedules, stop price wars, and combine resources. He stopped waste and created efficiency. Businesses felt the change right away. Suddenly, goods moved faster, and the market calmed down. Morgan was pulling the strings behind it all. His power wasn't limited to companies. Politicians started to listen to him too. Mayors, governors, and even senators knew that angering Morgan could hurt their local economies. He didn't hold office, but he had more influence than many who did. With quiet pressure, he shaped laws, guided policies, and protected his empire. Critics said he was too powerful, like a king without a crown. But Morgan believed he was doing what others couldn't. In his mind, America didn't need chaos, it needed structure. And if that meant one man had to be in charge, so be it. He didn't ask for permission. He just took control. Consolidation became Morgan's superpower, and as he built more systems under his rule, his name became a symbol, not just of money, but of American dominance. The railroads weren't just fixed. They were now part of his machine. By the 1890s, everyone on Wall Street knew where real power lived. It wasn't in Washington or the White House. It was inside the brownstone office of J.P. Morgan and Company. The House of Morgan had become a fortress of finance. It was where deals were made, wars were avoided, and industries were born. If Morgan said yes, America moved forward. Inside his office, Morgan held secret meetings with top bankers and CEOs. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. His presence filled the room. His nose was red from a skin condition, his eyes sharp and cold. People feared disappointing him. He didn't need to raise his voice. Silence was enough. Newspapers began calling him the most powerful man in America. His reach extended into every major industry: railroads, steel, banking, electricity. His company wasn't just a bank, it was a command center. Politicians, industrialists, even European leaders sought his opinion. He didn't run for office, but people treated him like a ruler. His control over the economy became legendary. If a railroad was failing, Morgan could save it. If the stock market trembled, Morgan could calm it. His name became a kind of financial spell. For some, he was a hero. For others, a threat. But no one could ignore him. The country ran on Morgan's approval. The House of Morgan wasn't built overnight. It was built through strategy, risk, silence, and control. And it was only the beginning. Morgan had used railroads to take power, but soon he would take on even bigger giants. In the 1880s, electricity was the newest force reshaping the modern world. Thomas Edison had dazzled the public with his electric light bulb and his system for using direct current, known as DC. Cities were starting to glow at night, and businesses wanted in. J.P. Morgan saw this not just as progress, but as an empire waiting to be built. He invested heavily in Edison's company and even installed electric lighting in his own mansion as a public statement. Morgan wasn't simply funding a scientist. He was betting on controlling the future. But Edison faced a powerful rival. Nikola Tesla, a brilliant immigrant inventor, had created a competing system, alternating current, or AC. George Westinghouse, a businessman with deep pockets, backed Tesla's invention. AC could carry electricity far longer distances than Edison's DC, making it cheaper and more efficient for large cities. The press called it the War of Currents. Each side fought fiercely, and the stakes were nothing less than who would power America. Edison, with Morgan's backing, launched a campaign to paint AC as deadly. Public demonstrations were staged where animals were electrocuted, using AC to shock audiences into fear. Newspapers printed warnings that alternating current would kill anyone who touched it. Morgan stood behind Edison during this offensive, believing control of the market depended on winning public trust. But as more tests and city contracts showed, AC proved to be stronger and more practical for real-world use. Edison's position grew weaker by the day. Morgan did what he always did when chaos threatened his investment. He stepped in and reorganized. He forced Edison's company to merge with other electric firms and took control of the board. Edison himself was pushed out of the company bearing his name. In 1892, Morgan created General Electric, combining several electric businesses into one giant corporation. Edison's direct current lost the battle, but Morgan had seized the infrastructure, patents, and leadership of the industry. This move cemented Morgan's reputation as the man who turned invention into empire. He didn't need to be an engineer or scientist. He needed to control the system. General Electric became the cornerstone of American power, lighting cities, factories, and homes under Morgan's command. The War of Currents ended with Tesla and Westinghouse winning the science, but Morgan winning the business. Electricity had been wild and uncertain. Now, like the railroads before it, it ran on Morgan's terms. By 1900, steel had become the backbone of American progress. It built the railroads, the ships, the bridges, and the rising cities. The undisputed king of steel was Andrew Carnegie, a Scottish immigrant who had built the most efficient steel empire in the world. His company ran like a machine, fast, cheap, and ruthless. But Carnegie was getting older, and he began thinking about retirement. J.P. Morgan saw this as the perfect opening to create something even bigger. Morgan had a clear plan: buy Carnegie Steel and combine it with smaller steel companies he already owned. He sent Charles Schwab, Carnegie's top man, to make the offer in secret. They met at Carnegie's home and wrote the deal out on a yellow notepad. The price? $480 million. It was one of the largest business deals in human history. Morgan didn't pay in cash. He paid in gold-backed bonds, making Carnegie the richest man in the world at the time. With a single stroke, Morgan created U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation on Earth. It absorbed more than 180 companies and employed over 160,000 workers. The company controlled nearly 70% of America's steel production. It wasn't just a business, it was a nation within a nation. Its size scared lawmakers and thrilled investors. For Morgan, it was the final proof that industry should be united under one roof, not divided by competition. Carnegie walked away from the deal smiling, finally free to focus on giving away his fortune. Morgan, on the other hand, stayed in the shadows and pulled the strings. He didn't manage U.S. Steel directly. He appointed others to do that, but everyone knew who had built it. Morgan's method was simple: use money to create structure, use structure to create power. Where Carnegie built factories, Morgan built systems. His version of empire didn't use brick or steel, it used paper. The Carnegie deal shocked the world. People had never seen a company worth $1 billion, or a man who could simply buy out the most powerful industrialist in America. Wall Street changed forever after that day. Morgan had turned American steel into one machine, and he held the controls. He wasn't just organizing companies anymore. He was organizing the entire economy. And the country was starting to ask, how much control was too much? After building empires in railroads, electricity, and steel, J.P. Morgan turned his eyes to the rest of the world. He had no interest in being just an American banker. From the start, his father, Junius Morgan, had built strong relationships with powerful European banks. When Junius passed away in 1890, J.P. inherited more than a name. He inherited a global network. The House of Morgan now had offices in New York, London, and Paris. Morgan's reach was no longer national, it was international. In London, Morgan's closest ties were with the Rothschilds, Europe's most powerful banking family. Together, they financed massive projects and lent money to entire governments. When European monarchs needed loans, they didn't always turn to their own banks. They came to Morgan. His firm helped stabilize currencies, fund infrastructure, and support the global gold standard. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a force in world finance, quiet, invisible, and deeply respected. Morgan used these connections to help American businesses expand overseas. He financed railroads in Mexico, helped electrify parts of Europe, and advised on steel contracts for foreign governments. He built partnerships with companies across continents, blending American capital with European access. His deals crossed oceans without ever being announced in public. And every time he shook hands, America's influence quietly grew. Morgan's power became a bridge between the old world and the new. Foreign governments often trusted Morgan more than their own banks. In times of panic, they looked to him for rescue. When markets crashed or wars threatened trade, Morgan's word could calm investors. He had become something the world had never seen before, an unofficial central bank with a human face. His reputation was so solid that even leaders from Germany and Britain sought his advice. No title, no throne, just quiet control. Morgan never boasted about this power. He rarely gave interviews and kept his work behind closed doors. But make no mistake, when the financial world turned upside down, people looked to him. The House of Morgan had become more than a company. It was a global command center, and behind every move was a man who didn't blink, didn't panic, and never asked permission. J.P. Morgan lived like a man who expected to be obeyed. His mansion on Madison Avenue was filled with imported furniture, rare rugs, and priceless artwork. He dined with kings and spoke directly to presidents, but he never chased fame. His real love was collecting. He bought rare books, ancient manuscripts, sculptures, and paintings from Europe's finest dealers. His collections were not random. They were carefully chosen symbols of taste, power, and civilization. To Morgan, art wasn't decoration, it was legacy. He built the Morgan Library in New York City to hold his treasures. From the outside, it looked quiet and modest. But inside were some of the rarest items in the world. Bibles from the Middle Ages, letters from royalty, and first editions of the world's greatest books. The Morgan Library wasn't just for storage, it was a statement. It told the world that Morgan didn't just control money, he controlled knowledge, history, and culture. And he built it not for show, but for permanence. In person, Morgan was a force. He had a massive figure, a booming presence, and a famously red nose caused by a skin condition. His stare was cold, his voice low, and his patience short. He didn't smile often, and when he entered a room, conversations stopped. He didn't shout to get respect, he just expected it. Even powerful men, bankers, politicians, railroad barons, lowered their eyes when he looked at them. His presence did the talking. Inside his office, rules were strict, meetings were short. There was no room for excuses or gossip. His employees knew not to waste a second of his time. Visitors were told to get to the point or get out. Yet despite the strictness, his office was a place where history happened. Deals were made that shaped the world, often in complete silence. Morgan never needed to show his power. Everyone in the room already knew who was in charge. To the public, he was part mystery, part giant. Some feared him, some respected him. Most had never met him, but they felt his decisions in their daily lives. He wasn't flashy like other rich men of his time. He didn't chase newspapers or fame. Instead, he built a life that spoke through its structure. Wealth without waste. Power without words, and influence that moved without being seen. As J.P. Morgan's power grew, so did public fear and anger. People began to question how one man could control so much of the nation's money, steel, railroads, and electricity. Farmers complained about unfair railroad rates. Small businesses said they couldn't compete. Workers saw him as someone who only cared about profits, not people. To many, Morgan wasn't a stabilizer. He was a threat to freedom. His name began to appear in editorials, speeches, and protest signs across the country. The press gave him a new title, robber baron. It was a term used for men who gained huge wealth by crushing everyone else. Political cartoons showed Morgan as a giant octopus. Its tentacles wrapped around banks, railroads, factories, and even the government. The message was clear. He had reached too far. While he rarely appeared in public, his shadow seemed to be everywhere. Every train ticket, steel beam, and light switch felt like it came from his hands. Progressive reformers demanded action. They said monopolies like Morgan's were destroying fair competition and strangling the free market. Leaders like President Theodore Roosevelt spoke out against big trusts, warning the public about the dangers of concentrated power. Morgan's deals were legal, but many felt they were unethical. People didn't want one man deciding the fate of entire industries. They wanted rules and someone to enforce them. Morgan ignored the noise. He believed he was protecting the economy, not threatening it. To him, efficiency was more important than opinion. While others debated fairness, he focused on control. He saw panic as weakness and reform as interference. But outside his office, a storm was building. Americans were no longer silent. They wanted their country back from the hands of men they had never voted for. The backlash reached its peak as Morgan entered the new century. The public didn't just want answers, They wanted limits. Government investigations were launched. Journalists dug deep into his operations. His name, once whispered in boardrooms, was now shouted in the streets. And soon, the most powerful man in finance would be forced to sit face to face with the power of democracy. By the mid-1890s, J.P. Morgan had become more than a businessman. He was a national institution. His word could steady Wall Street, and his presence alone was enough to calm panicked investors. But this kind of power did not come without fear. And in 1895, when the United States government found itself nearly bankrupt, the lines between business and democracy blurred in a way that would change the country forever. The Panic of 1893 had devastated the American economy. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared. By early 1895, the gold reserves backing the US dollar had fallen below $100 million, a dangerously low level. Confidence in the dollar was collapsing, and foreign investors began pulling their money out. If the country ran out of gold, it would no longer be able to back its own currency. America was on the edge of financial collapse. President Grover Cleveland and his administration were in a bind. The government needed gold to restore confidence, but Congress was paralyzed by political infighting. While Washington argued, Wall Street trembled. Cleveland feared that if nothing was done, the dollar would collapse and bring the entire economy with it. He turned to the one man with the credibility, connections, and cash to stop the bleeding, J.P. Morgan. Morgan, always calm in crisis, proposed a solution. Using a Civil War-era law, he would personally arrange for a $65 million gold loan to the U.S. Treasury. He would purchase government bonds and pay for them with gold, much of it drawn from his European banking partners, especially the Rothschilds in London. The deal was done in complete secrecy. Morgan, with no official government title, had become the savior of the American economy. When news of the deal broke, it divided the nation. Supporters praised Morgan for stepping in when the government had failed. The gold flowed into the treasury, the dollar stabilized, and the economy began to recover. But critics saw something much darker. They claimed Morgan had used the crisis to tighten his grip on the country. A private citizen had rescued the US government and made millions doing it. Newspapers across the country took sides. Some called him a hero, others called him a traitor to democracy. How had it come to this? How had one man gained so much power that even the president relied on him? Morgan brushed off the criticism. In his mind, he had done what was necessary, but for many Americans, the gold rescue marked a turning point. The age of unregulated power was starting to feel dangerous. Morgan's next battle didn't involve gold, but steel rails. In 1901, he helped form the Northern Securities Company, a giant railroad trust that combined several major rail lines in the American Northwest. It was a textbook Morgan move, efficient, well-financed, and designed to eliminate wasteful competition. By uniting the Great Northern, Northern Pacific, and Chicago, Burlington and Quincy railroads under one holding company, Morgan aimed to dominate the region's transportation. He saw the merger as smart business. The American railroad industry had always been chaotic, and Morgan believed consolidation brought order. Investors loved it. Stocks rose, and shipping became more predictable. But to newly elected President Theodore Roosevelt, the deal smelled like monopoly. Roosevelt had run on a promise to tackle corporate greed. The creation of Northern Securities gave him his first big test. In 1902, Roosevelt's Justice Department sued the Northern Securities Company under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The move sent shockwaves through Wall Street. The act had been on the books since 1890, but it had rarely been used with teeth. Roosevelt made it clear he intended to enforce it. And this time, his target wasn't a minor player. It was J.P. Morgan. Morgan was stunned. He had never been challenged so directly by a sitting president. He requested a private meeting with Roosevelt, hoping to settle things quietly. At the White House, Morgan famously said, "If we have done anything wrong, send your man to my man and they can fix it up." Roosevelt replied firmly, That can't be done. We don't want to fix it up. We want to stop it. The case dragged through the courts, watched closely by the public. In 1904, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against Northern Securities. The company was ordered to dissolve. It was a crushing defeat for Morgan and a defining victory for Roosevelt. For the first time in U.S. history, the federal government had successfully broken up one of the biggest monopolies in the nation. A message was sent. No man, no matter how rich or respected, stood above the law. The Northern Securities case was more than a legal battle. It was a direct confrontation between the two most powerful men in America. Morgan had long operated in the shadows, influencing presidents and markets from his private library. Roosevelt was the opposite, loud, public, and determined to use his office to serve the people. Their meeting in 1902 revealed how differently they viewed the world. Morgan genuinely believed that what he did was good for the country. By merging companies and reducing competition, he stabilized markets, saved jobs, and increased profits. He didn't view his empire as dangerous. He saw it as efficient. Roosevelt, on the other hand, feared concentrated power. He believed that unchecked monopolies threatened democracy, and that men like Morgan, no matter how well-meaning, could not be allowed to rule from behind closed doors. The Supreme Court's decision confirmed Roosevelt's authority. Morgan was forced to watch his carefully built trust unravel. He had lost more than a legal case. He had lost control of the conversation. Roosevelt didn't stop with Northern Securities. More lawsuits followed, targeting oil, meatpacking, and other industries. Morgan now found himself on the defensive. Although the two men maintained some level of mutual respect, their relationship remained cold. Roosevelt continued his campaign against monopolies, earning a reputation as a trust buster. Morgan, meanwhile, tightened his circle and kept a lower profile. He wasn't used to losing, and now, for the first time in his career, the government had put real limits on his power. This confrontation shifted the country. It gave rise to a new idea that the federal government could and should step in to protect the public from corporate overreach. Morgan had once been untouchable. Now he was vulnerable, and the American people were no longer willing to look the other way. As Roosevelt's lawsuits gained public support, Morgan's image began to crack. He was no longer seen as the wise financier keeping the economy afloat. Instead, he was portrayed as the man behind the curtain, pulling strings, rigging markets, and manipulating leaders. Political cartoons showed him towering over the Capitol building or wrapping his tentacles around the globe. The message was clear. Morgan had too much control. Journalists began investigating the scope of his empire. They uncovered just how many boards he sat on, how many companies he influenced, and how many industries were tied to his banks. Even his allies began to feel uneasy. If Morgan could finance wars, stabilize governments, and set shipping rates, was there any limit to what he could do? The American public was now questioning not just Morgan, but the entire system that allowed him to exist. Newspapers ran headlines asking whether democracy still mattered in a world run by money. Speeches on the campaign trail featured his name as a warning. He had once been the man who saved the dollar. Now he was the face of a broken system. Morgan did little to change the narrative. He refused interviews, avoided public events, and continued to operate from behind closed doors. To some, that silence seemed powerful. To others, it looked like guilt. The contrast between Roosevelt's energy and Morgan's secrecy only made things worse. It felt like a battle between the people and the elite. By the end of Roosevelt's first term, Morgan was still wealthy, still respected in financial circles, but his reputation with the public had suffered. He had become a symbol of everything Americans feared about unchecked capitalism, and that image would only deepen as the country pushed toward reform. The clash between Roosevelt and Morgan didn't just change laws. It changed the way Americans thought about money, power, and fairness. The country entered a new era of public debate. Could one man be allowed to shape the nation's economy? Should private interests have more say than elected officials? These were no longer radical questions, they were mainstream. Progressives in Congress began pushing for stronger antitrust laws. They demanded banking reform, campaign finance limits, and protections for workers. Writers, educators, and religious leaders joined the conversation. The Gilded Age had promised opportunity, but now many felt it had delivered inequality instead. Morgan's empire stood as proof. Some defended him. They said without Morgan, the economy would have collapsed years ago. They credited him with saving railroads, keeping gold reserves stable, and funding innovation. Others disagreed. They pointed to his secrecy, his profits, and his influence as signs of corruption. Morgan was not elected. He was not accountable. And yet, he seemed to make all the decisions. This moral argument reached deep into American society. In churches and schools, people debated not just Morgan's actions, but the values behind them. Was wealth itself bad? Or was it the misuse of power that had to be stopped? Roosevelt didn't want to destroy capitalism. He wanted to balance it. But Morgan's presence made that mission both urgent and personal. The stage was set for even bigger changes, and while Morgan continued to build and fund from behind the scenes, the country he helped shape was now demanding something new: fairness, transparency, and accountability. Morgan had ruled during the rise of America. But the question now was whether America still needed a kingmaker, or whether it was finally time to govern itself. By the autumn of 1907, the American economy looked like it was booming. But underneath the surface, it was fragile. Banks had lent too much money to risky ventures. Stock prices had been pushed up by speculation. There was no Federal Reserve to act as a safety net, no central bank to steady the market. Everything depended on trust. And when trust disappeared, so did money. In October of that year, trust vanished almost overnight. It started with the collapse of the Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the largest financial institutions in New York. Rumors spread that it had been involved in bad stock deals. Depositors panicked. Lines of people formed outside banks and trust companies, demanding to withdraw their savings. Bankers who had been confident one week were terrified the next. The stock market plunged as investors dumped their shares. Within days, the entire American financial system was on the edge of collapse. The government was powerless. President Theodore Roosevelt was traveling in the South, far from New York. The Treasury Department did not have enough funds to rescue failing banks. Without a central bank, there was no one to coordinate a response. Newspapers described the mood as financial terror. Ordinary workers feared losing their savings. Businesses feared losing their credit. Panic spread like wildfire through every corner of the economy. All eyes turned to J.P. Morgan. By 1907, he was 70 years old, but still the most powerful banker in America. He had stabilized railroads, created the first billion-dollar company, and even rescued the U.S. Treasury a decade earlier. Now, people asked if he could do it again. He had no legal authority to act. He held no public office, yet bankers, investors, and politicians alike looked to him as their only hope. Morgan moved quickly. He summoned the heads of the nation's biggest banks and trust companies to his home at 23 Wall Street. His library was famous for its dark wood, its priceless books, and its heavy doors. This time, it became a war room. Morgan understood the danger. If one large institution after another went under, the panic would cascade. He had to stop the chain reaction before it destroyed the economy. He began by assessing which banks were sound and which were beyond saving. Using his own staff, Morgan went through balance sheets late into the night. He decided who would get emergency loans and who would be allowed to fail. His reputation gave him leverage. Bankers, who might not cooperate with each other, were willing to listen to him. But he also knew time was running out. Each day, the panic grew worse. On the evening of Sunday, October 20th, Morgan gathered the top bankers again. This time, he locked them inside his library and refused to let them leave until they agreed on a rescue plan. The heavy doors closed, and the men sat at a long table under the glare of gaslights. Outside, carriages waited in the street. Inside, tempers flared. Some bankers resisted putting their money at risk. Morgan was unmoved. He told them the system would collapse if they did nothing. Hour after hour, they argued. The smell of cigar smoke filled the room. Morgan listened in silence, occasionally rising from his chair to speak. His voice was low, but his words carried weight. "We are facing the worst crisis of our lives," he told them. "If we fail, we take the country with us." One by one, the bankers began to give in. They pledged millions to shore up trust companies, backstop the stock market, and keep credit flowing. At dawn, the doors finally opened. A rescue plan was in place. The bankers had agreed to pool more than $25 million to stabilize the trust companies. Morgan personally pledged large sums from his own bank to stop the panic. The New York Stock Exchange opened that Monday with fresh cash ready to be used. Confidence began to return. The run on banks slowed. Panic gave way to cautious relief. Morgan didn't stop there. He orchestrated the takeover of weak institutions by stronger ones, arranged emergency loans to keep railroads afloat, and even supervised the rescue of the city of New York itself, which was on the brink of defaulting on its bonds. All of it was done without a single law compelling him. He simply acted. In a matter of days, he had built a private safety net for the entire financial system. The press hailed him as a savior. "Morgan stops the panic," read one headline. Crowds gathered outside his house to cheer, but not everyone celebrated. Critics asked how the richest banker in America could single-handedly decide which banks lived and which banks died. They pointed out that his interventions also strengthened his own position, giving him even more influence over the nation's financial life. Was he saving the system or taking it over? This question became louder in the months after the crisis. Congress launched hearings into the causes of the panic and the role Morgan had played. Testifying before lawmakers, he insisted he had acted out of duty, not greed. He said he had risked his own money and his reputation to prevent disaster. Yet the hearings revealed just how interconnected his empire had become. Morgan was not only the rescuer, he was at the center of the system that had failed. For ordinary Americans, the Panic of 1907 was a turning point. It showed how fragile the financial system really was. It also showed how much power one unelected man could wield in a time of crisis. Many people were grateful Morgan had acted, but they also wondered what would happen when he was gone. Who would save the country then? The idea of creating a central bank began to take hold. Out of that debate, 6 years later, came the Federal Reserve System. It was designed to do what Morgan had done in 1907, provide emergency credit, stabilize banks, and act as a lender of last resort, but as a public institution, not a private one. In a very real sense, the Federal Reserve was born from Morgan's library. His actions in 1907 had saved the economy, but also convinced the nation it could not depend on one man forever. The Panic of 1907 cemented J.P. Morgan's legend. It showed his ability to command, to analyze, and to act when others hesitated. It also deepened the fears about his power. He had locked bankers in a room until they agreed to save the system. He had done what the government could not. He was the closest thing America had ever had to a private central bank. And for a moment, the fate of the entire US economy rested in his hands alone. After the worst of the 1907 panic had been stopped, the country breathed a sigh of relief. But the questions didn't stop. J.P. Morgan had pulled the nation back from the edge of collapse, but the truth was hard to ignore. The US had no real system in place to protect itself. There was no plan, no institution. And if Morgan had not been there, or if he had failed, America might have fallen into total economic disaster. His actions may have brought stability, but they also showed how fragile the system truly was. In the weeks following the panic, people in power began looking closely at how the crisis had unfolded. The Treasury Department had been helpless. President Roosevelt had remained mostly hands-off, and the banks, scattered, private, and unregulated, had panicked just like the people they were supposed to protect. The only thing holding the system together had been J.P. Morgan's leadership, his reputation, and his money. That reality scared even Morgan's friends. He had created stability, but not the kind that could last. Newspapers called him the savior of Wall Street, but they also called him a symbol of too much power in the hands of one man. Some celebrated his quick decisions, his ability to force action, and his bravery in taking financial risks when others ran. But others warned that a system depending on one person was no system at all. Morgan wasn't elected. He didn't answer to the public. He didn't need permission. In that moment, he acted like America's unofficial central bank, and it had worked. But what if next time it didn't? Congress took notice. Hearings were held. Lawmakers wanted to know exactly what had happened inside Morgan's library. Who made the decisions? Who got saved and who didn't? Why were trust companies so vulnerable? The truth was uncomfortable. Morgan had handpicked who would live and who would collapse. He had judged their balance sheets. He had forced mergers. He had kept the doors locked until his plan was signed. His success had come from control, and it raised the fear of financial dictatorship. Morgan himself did not think of his actions as controversial. He believed in structure, discipline, and trust among powerful men. His goal was not to hurt small banks, but to keep the whole system standing. He saw finance as a machine, and he hated when its parts didn't work. By stepping in, he had kept that machine running. Still, he was old. He was nearing the end of his career. And even he knew that the next panic would need something stronger than one man with a library full of bankers. That's when the calls for a permanent solution began. Economists, business leaders, and some politicians agreed. America needed a central institution to manage money, credit, and crises. Other countries had one, like the Bank of England or the Bank of France. But the US had always resisted. People were suspicious of big banks, of federal power, and especially of anything that looked like the old European systems. Still, after 1907, public opinion began to shift. In 1908, Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, which created the National Monetary Commission. Its job was to study how other nations managed their banking systems and figure out how the US could do the same. Senator Nelson Aldrich, once a skeptic of central banks, became a key supporter. He worked closely with bankers, including Morgan's allies, to design a new system. Though Morgan himself stayed in the background, his shadow was everywhere. The system was being built to prevent the kind of emergency he had just solved. In 1910, Aldrich and a small group of bankers and experts met in secret at Jekyll Island, Georgia. Their goal? To design what would become the foundation of the U.S. Federal Reserve. It would be a network of regional banks overseen by a central board, able to lend emergency funds and guide national financial policy. It would have power, but that power would be public, structured, and legally controlled. It would replace the need for one man to act as the rescuer. J.P. Morgan was still alive when the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law in 1913. He had lived long enough to see the system he unofficially modeled now become real. Though he had no formal role in writing the law, everyone understood that his intervention in 1907 had made it necessary. He had shown the country what could be done in a crisis, but also why that kind of power shouldn't rest with one private individual. Even his enemies agreed. He had exposed the gap in the system, and now the system had changed. For Morgan, the idea of public banking was complicated. He didn't like government interference in markets. He trusted people, not institutions. He believed in personal responsibility and the judgment of men, not bureaucracies. But he also recognized the need for order. His life's work had been about bringing structure to chaos through railroads, trusts, industry, and finance. If a central bank could keep that structure in place, then perhaps it was the right path forward. By stabilizing the system during the Panic of 1907, Morgan had not only saved banks, he had created the argument for the future. He had proved that fast, centralized, well-funded action was the only thing that could stop a full collapse. And in doing so, he had made the case for a permanent institution that could act with that same force, but under the law. His legacy was now bigger than his companies or his fortune. It was embedded in the design of America's financial system. The irony is that Morgan, who had spent his life opposing regulation, helped bring it into being. Without meaning to, he had shown that too much power in too few hands was dangerous, even if it worked. And so, the country responded by creating a new kind of power, one that didn't rely on one man's library, but on national structure, shared authority, and long-term stability. The Federal Reserve was born, not in theory, but from the crisis Morgan had managed. In the years that followed, the economy continued to evolve. Crashes would still happen, and problems would still arise. But never again would the US be so completely dependent on one man's decision. J.P. Morgan had brought order during chaos, but he had also forced the nation to think about what real stability should look like. His action was temporary. The system that followed was meant to last. By the early 1910s, the man who once held the US economy in his grip was beginning to wear down. J.P. Morgan's health had been shaky since childhood, but now the years of stress, travel, and constant intervention were catching up to him. His body was tired, and so was his spirit. The world was changing rapidly, and Morgan, who had once controlled the pace, was now watching it move without his command. He no longer had the same energy to reshape entire industries or force boardroom decisions. The king of finance was growing quiet. Morgan also grew increasingly frustrated with politics. He disliked the public attacks, the endless hearings, and the press that often painted him as a monster. Though he had done more than most to protect the US economy, his name had become a symbol of unchecked power. He believed his actions had been necessary, rational, even noble, but the public didn't always see it that way, and that misunderstanding wore on him. He withdrew more from public life, appearing only when he had to. The man who once dominated Wall Street now spent more time in Europe or in his private sanctuaries. In March 1913, while traveling in Rome, J.P. Morgan fell seriously ill. His condition worsened quickly. At 75 years old, the man who had once been the pillar of American capitalism passed away quietly, far from the markets he used to command. Word of his death spread fast across Europe and the United States. Financial markets trembled briefly, unsure of what a post-Morgan world would look like. Banks and companies that had once depended on his word now had to stand on their own. It was the end of an era. His death marked more than the loss of one man. It marked the transition of American finance from personality-driven control to institutional regulation. In some ways, Morgan's passing was symbolic. The Federal Reserve Act had been signed just months earlier. The country was now stepping into a new chapter, one shaped by national systems rather than personal influence. But Morgan's shadow would linger for decades, not just in the banks and industries he shaped, but in the very idea of financial responsibility. For all his power, Morgan died with a relatively modest personal fortune by modern standards. He had created wealth for others, built massive companies, and held vast influence. But he never cared as much about money for himself. His death left behind a complicated legacy, one full of admiration, fear, and debate. Was he a savior or a symbol of too much control? The world would keep asking. Even after his death, J.P. Morgan's influence didn't vanish. It lived on through the institutions he built, the men he mentored, and the ideas he championed. The House of Morgan, the informal name for his financial empire, continued to shape banking in the US and abroad. His firm, J.P. Morgan and Company, remained a dominant force on Wall Street, managing corporate mergers, funding global ventures, and steering capital through turbulent times. What Morgan began as a private banking firm became a pillar of modern finance. Morgan was also a passionate art collector. He didn't just gather wealth, he collected culture. His love for rare books, manuscripts, paintings, and historical artifacts led him to amass one of the most impressive private collections in the world. After his death, much of it was turned over to public institutions. The Morgan Library and Museum in New York, which started as his private study, became a national treasure. It holds priceless works of art, literature, and history, freely open to the public. His commitment to the arts wasn't just about collecting, it was about preservation and legacy. Morgan believed that America needed to be more than just industrial. It needed to be civilized and cultured. He saw his role not just as a financier, but as a builder of national identity. Through donations to museums, universities, and libraries, Morgan left a cultural footprint that went far beyond the world of business. His family also continued his influence. Though no successor ever matched his dominance, the Morgan name retained weight in banking circles for decades. Partners in the firm, many handpicked by Morgan himself, carried on his methods: quiet control, deep research, and firm guidance during crises. The House of Morgan didn't just survive his death, it expanded. By the mid-20th century, it had become part of what we now know as J.P. Morgan Chase. The institutions Morgan helped shape would outlast him by over a century. From General Electric to U.S. Steel, to the modern banking system, his fingerprints remain visible. His library, his collections, and his codes of finance still impact how America understands wealth, power, and public responsibility. Whether admired or feared, J.P. Morgan built something far bigger than himself. More than 100 years after his death, J.P. Morgan's legacy still sparks debate. On one hand, he is remembered as the man who saved the U.S. economy in its darkest hours. On the other, he's viewed as the ultimate monopolist, a symbol of how private power can overwhelm public interest. His legacy is complicated because he operated in a time of transition, when America was trying to figure out the balance between free markets and government oversight. His impact on banking is undeniable. The very reason the Federal Reserve exists today is because of what happened during the Panic of 1907. Morgan showed what was possible when one man took charge, but also showed the danger of having no backup plan. The modern system of federal regulation, emergency lending, and monetary policy came directly from that moment. In that way, Morgan forced the government to grow up financially. J.P. Morgan Chase, the institution that bears his name, is now one of the largest financial companies in the world. It manages trillions of dollars in assets, and its decisions can still impact global markets. Though today's bank is very different from Morgan's original firm, the brand carries a weight that no other bank can match. The name Morgan is still synonymous with financial authority, both respected and feared. But the moral debate never ends. Was Morgan a hero or a threat? Did he protect capitalism or control it for himself? Was his dominance necessary in a lawless age? Or did it delay reforms that could have come sooner? These are the questions that still define how we think about power. In times of crisis, the world still looks for strong leaders like Morgan, but it also fears giving them too much control. In the end, Morgan's story is a warning and a model. He showed that one person can make a difference, but also that systems matter more than personalities. His life proved that bold action can bring stability, but also that unchecked power can become dangerous. He remains one of the most important figures in American history, not just for what he built, but for what he forced the country to confront. Who really owns the economy and who should?